All right, Lee Smith
Sean Franklin
from Blood and Iron Martial Arts, and we're going to answer your Patreon questions today, May
2017.
It's current year.
All right, so first we had a question about Meyers Circle. So the way it's described, the textbook variation, is it starts with a strike to the, it'll be from my left to their upper right opening, using the false edge with crossed hands. So I'm attacking like so. Now, if my opponent does a straight parry against this attack, from here, my sword runs off and then comes to the same side. Now, the way this works is if they just sit there, right? But usually when people get into a panicky pattern, they're moving back and forth, and it kind of acts like a feint. So, if I was here, I go boom, he's expecting me to now come to the other side, and I just go straight back to the same side. Now, this appears in both his main 1570 work and also his 1568 work. Now, knowing what we know about Meyer, this cut, which he just tells you what to do, but it's actually his left shield how, I mean, if you can do it on the right, because he talks about mirroring devices. So if I was to do this on the right, I would open the shield how, he would straight parry, I would let the sword run off, he's expecting me to go to this side, and I come back the same side. And he talks about it being like a feint, but much better, because rather than just not hitting, it actually hits rather hard on the blade, but then still rolls through and, makes the opening. So it's kind of a feint, but it hits hard as it runs through. Now, that would be the simple answer to the question. And if you've only read the 1570, which I think is the far superior text, that would be all you have. But this is the one instance where the 1568 sheds some light that we don't see in the 1570. Because much later, after he describes the circle, he talks about a different device. And this is when you attack high to the upper left opening, and then he says, bring the sword around in the circle to attack the lower opening. And then right after, he uses the same term, use attack in the circle to describe going from the lower opening on the right to circling around to the upper opening. So this is really interesting because it's a completely different context. And so I believe that this is the case of the original description of the circle with the false edge rolling through is not the circle. It's an example of a type of device called the circle, whereby you're attacking twice on the same side, letting the blade roll around in a circle. So rather than me just chopping at Lee,
Press R for block.
Exactly. I'm attacking and rolling in a circle to move back to the same side. It doesn't matter how I do it. I can go here, roll in a circle, come back. So this circle is not so much a specific play. The one he describes is actually probably one of the more difficult ones to do. It's very effective, but I would say the learning curve is a lot higher with the opening with the false edge on the left. So it's less a specific play, more of a way of attacking, whereas you circle around to come back to the same side. Now, the other complication is circle is a word. I mean, it's a technique, a device he describes, but it's also just a word. So you can never really be sure whether they're just talking about circle as in it's a circle, it's a geometric shape used to describe something, and circle, capital C, this is the device you're doing. So that's also kind of usually up to the translator too, whether they interpret it as a device in a certain context or just the circle, the shape in a certain context. But, I see similar patterns between the multiple devices. They use the same terminology and they kind of accomplish the same thing. So as far as I'm concerned, that's the circle where you roll around, you attack twice to the same side with a circling around motion rather than a chopping motion.
That's pretty common for Meyer to have explain one thing very, very in depth and then use that concept throughout different devices. So
absolutely.
It's kind of a Meyer thing. Okay, so Now, this question for our Patreon is height in HEMA and being a short guy. Well, as HEMA is one of HEMA's shortest champions and very successful fighter, yeah, thanks. Even when you can't reach the top shelf of the cupboard, doesn't mean you can't reach your opponent with a sword. Realistically, should you be training HEMA? Anybody can train HEMA, regardless of height or whatever. And being short just means your targets, the high percentage targets, change. So we'll start with the drilling question you had. The drills will change a little bit. His distance to hit me is greater than my distance to hit him. He has a firm kill, whereas I can't even reach him. So you'll get used to those distance differences. They don't look that big on a camera, but when you're fighting, they really add up. So your targeting will also change when you're working with your training partners. Whereas someone like Sean, I can still hit him in the head because our height differential is not so high. But if I'm fighting someone like Ben Floyd, for example, who's like 6'8", or just the absolute giant of a man, hitting his head for me at 5'9" is exceptionally difficult. So I'll be relegated to targets with your arms. I'll relegate targets like his arms, his legs. Everybody knows that, right, Richard Marsden? Yeah, you know that. And the torso. These become your primary targets. Thrusts also work really well. Once you've gained the blade, you've driven in, you can come in for those thrusts. If he's taller, Ben Floyd's side, that thrust for Sean would have hit Sean in the face, would have hit Ben square in the chest. So when we're looking at being a shorter HEMA fighter, all we do is just change where our targets go. Our high percentages shift. Just like a taller fighter, their percentages of where they hit shift. A very tall fighter, unless they're trying to hit me with a one-handed flat blow, is most likely not going to be targeting my legs, rather focusing on the upper quadrants. So, can shorter fighters fight HEMA? Absolutely. Guess what? The shorter you are, the better your ox protects you.
Okay, so next question was about the use of flourishes versus the use of binds.
So let's talk about flourishes first.
Yeah, so the flourish is not a combat device. The flourish is a training tool.
It's a sport-specific exercise, essentially. You're learning, using flourishes, you're learning to cut different patterns from different guard positions, or perhaps different positions you find yourself in during that exercise or during a fight.
Exactly. I mean, if you look at our flow drills video, I mean, we don't call them flourishes at Blood and Iron, but that is essentially what could be considered a flourish. And we use them extensively. The purpose is to train you to be able to move between all your cuts and, as you end a cut in a guard position, all your guards effectively and fluidly.
While maintaining edge alignment, which is pretty key.
Yeah, very key, which a lot of people miss on their flourishes.
And you correct them and so on. But that's what a flourish is used for.
Exactly. So it's a training tool, not a combat device. So it's when we look at the bind, then we it's an apples to oranges comparison rather than, which should you be using. They do different things.
Or maybe even a vegetables to meats comparison. It's pretty far off. They're not even in the same vein.
Although in this scenario, vegetables to meats, one is clearly superior to the other. But.
It's true, but at the same time, they complement each other because they're both things you have to train.
Yeah.
You got to eat your vegetables, and you got to eat your meat,
exactly.
And you got to train your flourishes, and you got to train your binds.
Yeah. So moving on to the bind. The bind it's something that happens when we fight. So we both swing at each other. Boom, we're threatening each other. We've got a bind. So it's not a case of flourishes versus binds, because if I'm just planning on fighting Lee and I'm like, oh, look at my sweet flourish, well, this only ends one way. So, but if I've trained my flourishes well, I can move my hands quickly. If we meet in the bind, I can do many things, but one of the things I can do is leave and quickly roll around, because I've trained that quick handwork from my flourishes. So I'm not using the flourish, I'm using the skills I've learned from the flourish.
Just like if we meet up in the bind here, if the person's clearly broken, they haven't trained the bind work, now I'm here in the grapple, my pommel's in his teeth. You can collapse their guard, collapse their weak structure, and do as you will with them.
Yeah, so say that's not a case of flourishes versus bind. And then the bind work is super important because if we're both threatening each other, we've both thrown threatening attacks. We can't just leave. Because by definition we're threatening. Swords meet, bind forms, and then we use the bind work. So
and devices from that.
Exactly.
It's extremely important to train both. Your flourishes help you learn how to use the sword in, like using its cutting angles, basically understanding how to move the sword efficiently. Or the bind work, it helps you understand when you're actually opposing a resisting and non-compliant opponent.
Yep.
So a little more on the flourish. Like back when we started doing HEMA tournaments here in the U.S. and North America, this is Canada, but you get what I'm saying. When we started doing HEMA tournaments, Matt Gallus had this thing called the Parat. I mean, it's basically a flourish you enter in when you're in the finals. So you come in, you show your opponent your skills, and then he does his Parat, he shows you his skills. And he found his documented evidence of this to say, oh, these guys did this to kind of show off to the crowd and their opponent what they were made of. Now, that's another use for a flourish. Now, in current uses of HEMA tournaments, we don't actually do those.
And yeah, pretty much, with our modern context, if you try and do that before your fight, rather than people thinking you look really cool, they just think you look like a tool out there. So it kind of defeats the purpose. But
and you expend energy.
Yeah, so it's that was another historical context for the flourish, which isn't super modern nowadays. But the idea being that if you've trained to be super good in this flourish that impressed the crowd back then, it's probably because you just trained a lot to begin with. So it showed all of your training, which is what we were talking about earlier with using them a lot to train to move your sword between your guards and your cats.
But also there's perhaps maybe they threw money on the stage when these guys were doing that. I'm not going to lie, if people were throwing dollar bills at me and stuff, in the U.S. tournaments, I would probably definitely, and there's enough of them, I definitely would do a Parat. I think Sean would also do the same.
All right, so yeah, that's what we got to bring to the HEMA tournaments from now on.
Yeah, make that money.
awards for best flourish before your finals fight.
Throw us the money. It's like HEMA strippers. Okay, so on the bind work. More on the bind. So we're here, we're in the bind. So from here, Sean's going to do something pretty cool.
So from here, I can move the sword and execute this device. Now, the question is this harder than just attacking him from the other side? Well, yes. The reason why I'm using it is because he's threatening me at the same time. That's what makes a bind a bind. If he's just pushing on my sword to the side, well, why would I try and do something so difficult when I can just, boom. And that's the handwork I learned in my flourish. So that's where, a little bit you start seeing the difference. I mean, even in the first example, when I did that, I'm using the handwork I learned from the flourishes, but at the same time, I'm using bind work. I'm feeling that he's threatening me. The second example is just pretty much exactly like I would have trained it doing my flow drills. So that's one example. You can see the interplay between the two, even though they're not apples and oranges, there is a connection.
All right, big thanks to our Patreon subscribers for making this happen.
This episode was a collection of questions from all our Mailbag level supporters. If you're interested and you have a question for us, definitely drop by our Patreon page. All of our Mailbag supporters, once a month, will answer a question in the same level of detail we just did today.
Also, if you're short, you can also just get jacked.
Works if you're tall too. Drop by our Patreon page and support us and enter the Mailbag page. Support us at the I was about to combine Mailbag and Patreon to say Matreon level.
Matreon. This is like the Drow Underground.
Yeah. I was like, I kept trying to it kept going I was like, no, I'll go this way. Then it's no,